The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 1. I'm gonna ignore the Flintstones unless they're relevant to the Jetsons. So we'll start out talking about the Jetsons story on page 18. The family is dancing to the music of a band while Elroy's teacher tells him over Skype to get back here and says he'll never get promoted otherwise. And Elroy's riding a hoverboard for fun when he knows he'll get yelled at, because he knows he won't be punished for it, and he was bored by history. The teacher with the great design says brilliantly that people care about history when they learn how important one of their ancestors is to everyone's lives now. Conveniently, Judy's not playing her music loud enough to not be able to hear her. It sure is convenient that the teacher knows about one of their ancestors when the family doesn't, even though he had a different last name, because she did the research to make sure she could get them to care about history when it's not history that's mandatory for the school curriculum. She says their ancestor invented fire when it can't be invented, and instead the use of fire in a safe way would be, but it'd be invented by tons of people other than him. There'd be no way to prove he was the first one to ever think of how to use a flaming tree branch, when there's tons of other people, because there were no written records back then. I wonder how Astro's leash is wrapping around George and making him float. The teacher tells the family to meet the rest of the class at the museum. George gets inexplicably flung through the screen and is dazed. She tells him he'll be late for work if he keeps putting things off, and doesn't look sympathetic to him enough after he cracked the window behind him, when any other family would advise him to go to the hospital. Judy helps him up as he pets Elroy. He kisses Jane's cheek saying he loves her and jumps off the tower sitting on a briefcase to press a button and turn it into a car that starts flying ahead right away. He goes to work and says he makes $1,000 a day as he heads for the employee login area. An eye scanner tells George to prepare to be scanned, and George says Spacely won't dare risk the unions closing him. If the writer knows this, there was no excuse for this happening. George somehow gets electrocuted, which of course would get Spacely in big trouble. Finally, George gets introduced to Fred Flintstone's descendant. How ridiculously convenient that his family line survived this long. Spacely tells George it's about time he showed up. Why is he picking on him and not the co-workers around him who showed up at the same time? Spacely says there's an emergency and Fred thinks it's an opportunity. Spacely says the museum needs a sprocket for the last flame exhibit. This is such a ridiculously convenient coincidence to have them go there that I can barely take it seriously when it could have easily not happened. George volunteers right away, wanting to suck up to the boss, and the ridiculously named Fred catches up to him in his car. I'll call him Fred anyways, they shouldn't have even tried. The two cars drive through a wall in the museum. There's no way these two would do that because they know they'd get in legal trouble for it. But somehow nobody worries about this. Instead, Elroy just thinks he made a cool landing. Why does he say landing in an entrance? I'm sure his landing was normal. Judy asks George if he's okay. I'm somehow expected to believe they have the first flame made by humanity in a museum and were always keeping it lit, when how would they ever know which one that was? And George trips on rubble, and Fred trips on him and falls onto something. Too bad the story ends there. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 2. It's too bad when I finally see a Jetsons character again, it doesn't continue where he left off in the last issue. Why end a story on a cliffhanger just to never follow up? There's a joke as George says this 11-2 grind is killing him, and he's told by someone that Spacely wants him in his office right away. Spacely says he's been reviewing his record out of spite, and seeing how many times he's screwed up, he's proud of the work he's done lately because he went a week without a mistake. Why didn't he fire him before this week? It should be explained that it's nearly impossible to find a replacement for George. He says nicely that he'll be up for a promotion if he keeps up being as competent as this, even though he's lucky he can go as long as this without screwing up. George's salute he could have easily not decided to do, because it's not the military, flips the lever that causes an overload. That won't be in the boss's office. Spacely tells him he reset the sprockets on something that controls all the waste disposal units in the city. So because he cares about it causing an environmental catastrophe, which must be because he doesn't want to be held liable, he fires him for the issue. Why did a guy who only has his building dedicated to making sprockets even have this kind of lever? Jane complains about Elroy breaking something of hers by accident and says she's lucky she doesn't have to carry garbage 3 whole feet to a can because she can just press a button on her remote. And she says Spacely trash disintegrators are great. It creates more garbage instead. And there's another joke, as she says looking freaked out, that it'd take minutes to clean the normal way. Finally, she says stop this crazy thing. I assume this is George's fault. Astro plays catch and Elroy compliments and pets him. Either there's a time skip, or Elroy reads his mind before somehow deciding to parrot back that he said he has to go to the bathroom behind a holographic tree. This is far from the only expensive, unnecessary technology that's all over Orbit City. I always assumed that all that stuff got paid for by some nice rich person, so that it's installed in even the normal middle-class person's house. Elroy talks about how his grandfather had to pick up after his dog with paper, and he's glad he can press a button to zap it away. There's no way paper would become considered a primitive fabric. Schools will always be using it for books. Even libraries are a lot less financially troubled than you'd expect nowadays. It's shocking that we actually get shown what's somehow being made bigger along with the garbage when it's not made of the same material as it. I think the censors wouldn't let this get shown. George drives home looking worried and says that his $600 million in severance pay will only last a week. That's the future, so who knows how bad inflation would have gotten. It's probably because of all Jane's shopping. George doesn't let his family finish complaining about their interesting problems because he's upset, and it's not like them to put up with him just saying he's gonna go lie down when they went to him for help. As usually they have all the power over him. Jane would just use his full name and order him to go back to her. He uses the video phone and effortlessly calls the secretary of Mr. Cogswell because I guess she's in the yellow pages. Somehow, Mr. Cogswell has heard a rumor that George is one of Spacely's best workers. So he already offers him a job as a janitor. Why janitor when that's not what he's got experience doing? He could hire anyone for that job. Not to mention, if he thinks he's one of his best workers, why would he just hire him to be a janitor when he could hire anyone to be a janitor to humiliate them? Why is the story running off nothing but unlikely things happening? George is at least thankfully still providing for his family, and finds out Spacely's comes his rival for help somehow, because the only way to reset the sprockets is to replace the cog which Cogswell manufactures. Cogswell must have legally changed his last name, because what are the odds of this? Of course, the last name Jetson and Spacely are unrealistic too. Cogswell says that for 51% of Spacely's sprockets he'll help. He tells Spacely to bark too, and it's satisfying to see him bark on his knees. George agrees to try to clean up the ashes with a button press, and they grow. Cogswell admits because of this that he forgot he relies on the Disposatrons too. This has him tell Spacely he can have all the cogs he wants if he resets the machine quickly. He fires George for doing something that had him say this. I wonder if this is wrongful termination. But before I could wonder why George won't sue him, Spacely hires him back for helping him, which is very nice because it was an accident. He also offers him a key to the executive washroom. It's especially nice because this mistake didn't prove that he'll never make a mistake like the lever incident again. The story ends with them telling George to clean it now that the Disposatron's been fixed off screen. I know it'd be boring to watch a machine get fixed, but it still feels too underwhelming that I didn't get to see even one panel of it. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 3. George forbids Elroy from playing practical jokes after he suffers from him putting itching powder in his shirt. It's pointless to do that because he should have known he wasn't allowed to do that in the first place. So that wouldn't stop him. But when Jane tells him Spacely's coming over, somehow he wants a practical joke to play on him when it's obvious he'd fire him for it. If he knew it was him. If he knows he'll rehire him no matter what, why does he still care when he fires him? Elroy presents him with a bottle that says Big Baby that he just got, and he's not sure what it does, even though you'd think he'd have been able to read something to find out, or been told what it did. It's too obvious what it's gonna do, at least to the audience who saw the cover and the words on it. But since these characters don't know they're in a cartoon, they probably are willfully ignoring the obvious possibility because they think it'd be too silly. I could assume a witch made it. In the future, it'd be easy for a witch to pass off her witchcraft as technology, and it'd have to be that instead of technology developed by people, because there's no way this would be permitted to be developed with science when it could affect anybody, including the president and his security guards. It'd be excellent to use on soldiers and protesters, so it has its uses, but who would ever give it to anyone, no matter what their job is, when he could lend it to someone else, or get stolen from? So at that rate, it certainly wouldn't be legal for the average Joe. So Elroy must have gotten this from the black market, and I wish I knew how he found that. It makes sense that George didn't test this out first, because the doorbell rings in the next panel from Spacely. I guess George is a high-ranking employee if he's coming here to talk to him about this meeting he's got in 2 days. George spikes his drink with the liquid. Spacely thanks him for offering him a soda, and when he drinks it, he immediately turns into a baby, who wouldn't have a diaper immediately available. Surprisingly, he's not a big baby though. Obviously, a part of the Big Baby potion is preserving the original mind in a small CPU in him, and diverting the brain signals to that. Hence the big part of the name, because he's still an adult mentally. So that's why Spacely can still talk like normal. I'm glad he can, because it's a lot better for the comedy, and it's more creative. I don't know why the potion preserves the confusing pink circle around Spacely's face and his mustache. Maybe it's made that way on purpose for laughs. He tells George to get him to his kids' doctor. I just had the family doctor, never a specific kids' doctor. He also tells them to get him baby clothes, which either they have from Elroy still, or they sold or donated them already. I like seeing even Jane say, "Yes sir, Mr. Spacely, sir." The doctor immediately knows what happened to Spacely, so he must have scanned his body to find out, meaning that the anti-aging serum is more well known than something presidents aren't immune to should be. It doesn't matter that it wears off in 2 days. The presidents would be easy to defeat like this. So this would be constantly happening all over the world. The doctor warns George that Spacely's gonna be a total baby emotionally, and Spacely's just annoyed at hearing George say he can't tell the difference, so as usual, he's unusually merciful. Speaking of that, he tells George he's not going to fire him, and he's not even going to press charges because it'd be too embarrassing if word of this got out, as we see him sitting on George as he's crawling around. The only way he actually could press charges is if there's a law against turning someone to a baby for 2 days. So does he care so much about his wife not finding out this happened to him that he's gonna ever worry about where he went for 2 days and accuse him of cheating instead of just trusting her to take care of him? George thanks him, and Spacely gets given a chair with its own table low enough to impress him. He says he should get one of these for his office. I guess his logic is that anyone who dares to make fun of it would be fired. Right after saying he doesn't like this baby food and wants what they're having, he tells George he's not supposed to give him any, so he just couldn't help but complain earlier. Somehow he can't resist the urge to fling mashed peas around even though he thinks they're delicious, despite still having his original mind. Maybe he's doing this because he's sadistic, because he laughs about how George has to clean this up. George shouts and Spacely cries because he scared him, and Jane shames him for not having the self-control to not shout at a baby, so again it's annoying that she's not on his side for some reason. Jane tells Spacely a bedtime story with a monitor saying "The End" in front of him. I guess she only read off the monitor. He thinks the story was stupid, but sadly doesn't explain why to provide an adult perspective on it and wants something more spicy. Jane gets Elroy to take him to play with his toys. He thanks Elroy, and it's also amusing that he says what he plans to do with them. After patting, predictably he wakes George up with his crying, and at least explains he had a nightmare. He's lucky he can get told what he wants. It's also amusing that Spacely tells him he needs burping and that he should have thought of that. And he tells him to stick around because he'll need changing real soon. I guess he assumes he wouldn't be able to figure out how to put a diaper on himself. The next day, George prepares to leave for work with a hat he never wears. And he tells someone over a video phone that Spacely had to go out of town on urgent business. Then he tells his coworker that he's got to go home and feed mush to Spacely. I have to assume he's so tired that he doesn't realize or care that he just let the cat out of the bag. Spacely is taking full advantage of things by sadistically smashing something with a hammer, and Jane's a lot worse with how she's treating George here. They never draw George to do this to her, because only then would they realize he was crossing a line. Of course, George says he's worse than Elroy was. Then he says they can program Rosie to take care of him. Why didn't they always have her do this? Why did he say program instead of tell her to when she's as smart as a human? Why wasn't she in the story the whole time? She wouldn't have a day off. How does George think he has to introduce Spacely to Rosie when Spacely met her in her first episode? So this is another continuity entirely. Or somehow the writers never even watched the first episode, which anyone would have done. I know Flynn didn't watch Sonic X before he wrote the comic for it. Rosie must be trying to mock him when she calls him Baby Spacely, because she doesn't have to. She brings him to a cage and threatens to spank him to get him to try to sleep. It's interesting that this was written in a 90s comic. They really wanted to stay true to the show in that one aspect. George gets a good night's sleep, and out of complete nowhere, Spacely tells him Rosie's getting him the discipline he should have had when he was younger, when I wouldn't expect him to approve of it. He tells him a plan, and George heads towards his workplace in a disguise with Spacely in a baby carrier, and somehow his coworker instantly recognizes George. Then he sees Spacely and assumes that he took a baby and made it look like Spacely as a joke. He calls it cruel, and Spacely thinks he's an idiot, which wouldn't be true if the big baby potion was obscure enough that it'd make sense for him to not know about it. But even Elroy got it. Spacely tells George that he's changing back and wants some real clothes, having the foresight to know that George would have messed things up if he had gone in his place. Yeah, but it would have been more interesting story. George calls Jane to tell him that Spacely's in the meeting, and then Rosie embarrasses Spacely by telling him it's time for his changing. She'd see that he's not a baby, so the only reason she'd still do that is that she's trying to humiliate him because she thinks he deserves it, and that George deserves a better boss, because she'd know this would get him fired. He does get fired, and the story ends with Spacely and George inexplicably wailing in front of people. If the comic had continuity, it tried to explain how he got his job back, but nothing would really justify that, and I'm really glad it's not serialized. That means there's more variety in what kind of plots there are. He could have passed it off as Rosie glitching out if he didn't get forced by the writer to call her mommy. This story with an expendable start has George get sent to a museum by an unlikely coincidence where he has to bring a sprocket there. And Fred Flintstone's descendant wants to get promoted by doing the job before George, so he follows him there. They crash their cars through the museum's wall, which creates a plot hole if they won't get punished, and Fred ends up tripping over George and falling onto something. It's sort of a disappointing story as barely anything happens and it just seems to be silly. But it's not so bad if the only things forced about the story are how it relies on unlikely coincidences. Because that's the weakest plot hole. And I'm just grateful it involved the descendant of Fred being an exciting rival for George. Still, he's just annoying. This story had George accidentally flip a lever by saluting to suck up to his boss, even though he's not in the military, which causes a problem where anytime someone tries to zap away garbage with a remote, the garbage grows. Even though Spacely's building is about making sprockets, not this. I like the variety in how this affects two different members of his family, and Cogswell when he hires George as a janitor right away. And this makes him fire George because seeing it made him agree to Spacely resetting the machine without having to do anything for him. Spacely miraculously hires George back despite knowing he's incompetent and knowing that he only did this by accident. It was an interesting story, It was engaging that both Jane and Elroy saw the garbage get inexplicably enlarged, and it felt like it was building up to some bigger climax, just for the machine to be fixed off screen. I can't honestly say it's a well-written story because of how ridiculous it is. But at least it's interesting, so, like most of this comic, it's a good kind of bad. This was a constantly charming story about Spacely getting turned into a talking baby for a few days, because Elroy somehow got a hold of something to do that when it'd be illegal. I like seeing him talk like himself regardless while taking full advantage of things. It was mean, but it was funny enough to be worth it. And it was great that Rosie came in to get him under control. And while she would have been taken advantage of right away if the plot was trying to be more believable, it would have been as entertaining and interesting then. The plan Spacely came up with for George to take his place and follow his orders in a meeting wasn't as entertaining as them somehow getting treated like a baby by Rosie in front of people. If it was easier to get me to laugh, I would have found the whole story hilarious. This might be the funniest story in the comic.